I had a question to see if I could kind of further explain what was going on in the training slide that talked about how we can use training to specifically improve on the force velocity curve. Before we go there, I'm just going to kind of reiterate what the force velocity curve is and give us a better idea of how this works so that we can then transfer it into some exercise physiology and training. So kind of the first idea and how we define this force velocity curve is it essentially describes the relationship between force and velocity during a maximal effort muscle contraction. And so if we come to the graph here, this is your very classic graph that you'll see if you Google force velocity curve. Almost all of them will look the same. This one is kind of coming out of our textbook for Kramer, but each dot we can kind of idealize as this is the idea. We told a person, we gave them a set amount of weight and said, lift this as fast as you possibly can. So here we're at a force or a very low weight, and you can see the idea that this person can move that weight extremely fast. On the opposite end of this spectrum, if we give them a heavy weight, we ask them to lift it as fast as they can because of the force needed. The amount of time in which it takes to generate that muscle contraction is going to be very long or relatively slow. So the idea is that when we move high loads, we have a shortening velocity. Again, on this entire portion of the curve on this side, these are all concentric contractions. That tells us that the amount of force that we're able to generate is more than the force in which we're working against. Therefore, the action in the muscle is a shortening action. Right? So to further define this, we can look at that the relationship here during concentric contractions is what we consider a negative or an inverse relationship. In other words, as the force goes up, the velocity in which we are able to make that contraction work goes down. One note that is something that if you want to tie this into kind of understanding how a muscle contracts is the reason that this force-velocity relationship works is because if we think about the main determinant of force being the number of cross bridges that can be formed in the skeletal muscle, right? When we try to make a fast movement, the velocity must be quick, therefore the lower number of cross bridges can be formed, therefore depressing force. In the opposite side of things, in a very heavy situation, when we're moving the weight very slow, lots of cross bridges are able to be formed, therefore a high amount of force is generated. It's just generated very, very slowly. So that kind of gives you an idea of how cross-bridge cycling and the force-velocity curve work in the concentric phase. Right? As we continue up to that, there does become a point in which you can hold the weight without it moving in a maximal contraction, and that point here is where velocity equals 0, so V equals 0, and we can better define this as maximal isometric force. This is the maximum amount of force in a muscle can essentially hold in an isometric contraction. In other words, where there is no change in length. It doesn't shorten or it doesn't get longer. Instead, it maintains the exact length. As the amount of weight or force that were added here becomes more than we can possibly hold. So if you can just imagine holding on to the weight for a while, when it becomes more than you can hold, then what happens is the muscle starts to lengthen because velocity is now going opposite of the direction in which you're trying to perform the contraction. So therefore we say the velocity is now in the negative side of things, and you can start to see that the heavier the force, we kind of get the relationship here with the ultimate idea that it's relatively well accepted that we can generate about 50% greater amount of force in the eccentric contraction than we can in a maximal isometric contraction. So this really tells us that when as we look at the three different types of contraction, eccentric and isometric and a concentric contraction, that concentric would be a lower force, isometric would be more force, and an eccentric is the most force a muscle can produce. Now to look at this in training, we introduced, so here's kind of the curve filled out to kind of make it smoother instead of a single point. But as we kind of then moved into the specificity, and the idea is that this is a kind of a key principle of exercise physiology in that your body adapts specifically to how you train it. So kind of a broad-based example would be if you're an endurance runner, right? You run long distance and your body adapts to being a long distance runner. If you're a sprinter, you avoid those types of exercises because you don't want your body adapting to be a long duration runner. You want the positive adaptations that would make you a better sprinter. And so we can use that principle of the idea that specificity is defined as the quality of belonging or relating uniquely to a particular subject. Again, if you want to get better at math, you don't study English, you study math, right? So in the exercise phys world, we can say that performance in a given task will only improve if you specifically train that movement or task. Right? And so we can look at this force velocity curve in this way. Right? If you have needs in the sport, whatever your sport is, and we can say if your sport is predominantly dependent on power and speed, or sorry, on just speed, that it doesn't matter how much force you have to generate, you just have to generate it extremely quickly. Well, then if you look on how to improve this, you can train at this part of the force velocity curve. So what I've done is just taken the concentric part of that force velocity curve. So this is the concentric part, so we're able to perform all of these movements and shortening contractions. So as you work primarily only on speed, well then you do velocity, you perform exercises that are at high velocity, and therefore because of that they have to be low force. On the other hand, if you're looking at some type of exercise that is important, or some type of competition where high forces are commonly used and it doesn't really matter the speed in which those contractions are being done, then of course you need to train at that maximal strength, at that high load part of this. So this way we're training all strength, very little velocity. So something like maybe a power lifter who is just trying to lift a high amount of weight, doesn't matter how much they need to do it, well they're likely going to spend a lot of time working on this part of the force velocity curve. Right? Realistically, most people are going to be working somewhere in here. So strength training, maybe 75 to 90%. Power training, somewhere right in between. Power being a nice combination between speed and force produced, and kind of to optimize that. And you can see we can work here in the middle, so do some training on the higher end in order to train force, do a little on the lower end in order to train speed, and that's a great quality to have for exercise. So again, the idea is just matching performance with how you train. And if we look at this, this is a figure from the Kramer book as well, that just kind of shows how these training paradigms can be. And essentially, I've asked the two questions here. So which figure represents a person who focused on high force production in their training? So again, type of training that would be specific to not worrying about the velocity, but would mainly generate high force. And so if we look at the graphs, so the blue line is before training and the orange reddish color is after training. What we can see if we highlight the beginning part of this curve is that this person obviously focused on high force production. The reason for that, right, we can see two reasons. One, their maximal force went up, which is good. So they had an increase in maximal force. They also didn't see any improvements, if not maybe even slight decrease in performance in velocity. Again, highlighting that specificity. If you train strength, you get good at that. If you don't train speed, then you either stay the same or potentially get worse in these types of scenarios. If we look at this other part, this would be the person that I would highlight that said this is speed training. You can see they didn't improve overall strength. So think about this as a 1 rep max. They didn't really improve overall in strength. However, after training here, you can see that their force and velocity being produced is much higher after speed training at these kind of low intensities. So they're able to train this. And again, as you think about how this works in exercise physiology, the goal is just to get an idea of what your athlete or client or person is looking for, and then specifically meet those. in all honesty, how most training programs work is you work all along this force velocity curve and you don't highlight either one. But as a teaching principle, it's nice to sometimes just pick the outer edges and look at them there. And I've grabbed one more kind of graph off of the web. Let's see. That kind of shows and looks at both of these in kind of putting them on the exact same graph. And so we can look at example of force velocity curve, the classic blue line. And again, someone who's speed trained, not really getting improvements in force, but getting improvements in velocity, and someone who's strength trained, getting improvements in force, but not in velocity as we look there. So that really highlights those two aspects of both the force velocity curve and how we can use that to kind of determine what is best for our athlete and how they work on each of those.